Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much, Dr. Flick, for giving us the opportunity of speaking in front of such a renowned audience in order to share our important views on this very important subject matter with you. Between what is and what should be societies that break their laws as a threat to liberty. I'm going to look at things from a slightly different angle than my friend Shaukat Aziz. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we're living at a time within which we can really talk about failing states. Poor governance and failing states, not only with regards to the economic governance or global governance by and large, but I'd also like to take a closer look at the nitty-gritty of national, regional, and local connections. I would also like to highlight the fact that there are ample opportunities out there to develop new strategies and embark on new paths, especially with the help of organized civil society organizations, because I learned from experience that we, as organizations of civil society, can be and have been very successful in a rather difficult situation when we were sort of in a catch-22, when many other organizations of the world and many institutions had lost their power to create a better world on the basis of good governance. By the way, dear Shaukat Aziz, I welcome the fact that you combine deregulation with independent regulation, because I would not argue in favor of deregulation without any conditions, but I would ask for better regulations, which are currently missing. Especially in a global economic system, we are all intertwined with each other. We are suffering predominantly due to obsolete paradigms. We have lost the possibility of giving shape to economic developments. Society has sort of been subjected to the forces of the market. The primacy of politics over the economy is something that has been dissolved, especially with our sovereign nation states and their governments. We can't take that much action any longer because we are subjected to the forces of the market. But sometimes we rely too much on the quality of regulations, although these regulations are not effective and efficient enough in order to create a progressive, fair, and just world which does justice to future generations who can benefit from prosperous developments. My example is international corruption. That is an example in a field where I personally gathered a lot of experience. And I think similar experience and good experience can also be collected in the field of other areas where states fail, in the field of, for example, climate change or the deterioration of the environment, human rights violations, big conflicts, the exploitation of women and children, the violation of basic rules for health and safety at the workplace. In all these areas, governments have failed. And this has led to an unacceptable, rather devastating result. A result which simply cannot be accepted. Let's take a look at the world within which we live. Shaukat Aziz says deprivation leads to extremism and terrorism. Yes, this is most definitely true. We are currently living in a world where 1 billion people live below the poverty line. 1 billion people in today's world, and in Marseille it was decided that it was only 900 million, do not have acceptable access to potable water. Millions and millions of people do not have access to a clear water management system or sanitation. Therefore, simple diseases cause the death of many women and children, cause great misery and pain. 10 million people every year die before they reach the age of 5. Such a world is simply unacceptable. And for that matter, we've got to think of ways and means of changing new paradigms. We need to bring about a shift of paradigms because it is necessary to look at things from a different angle. A process of rethinking needs to be initiated. As Dr. Flick said, we need to come up with new ways of dealing with good governance in a globalized economy. Many people assumed for a long period of time that the asymmetry of things that need to be brought under control and the possibility of nation states to bring about rules and regulations can be overcome. These asymmetrical structures can be overcome by addressing global aspects in the private sector. Of course, these asymmetrical structures would also have a global dimension, but nonetheless are also of temporary significance because many nation states, especially democratic states, from one election to the next, every 3 or 4 or 5 years, develop new ideas because this is when they want to be re-elected. This is when vested interests have to be taken into account more than anything else. And they have to serve the interests of particular target groups in a nation state, and this prevents you from developing real global strategies. Is the private sector the really solution? I remember a conference in Boston when Shimon Peres spoke before me, and he said, no, the time of multinational corporations have come because they've got the global reach, which is now required that the nation states have lost. They've got global resources. They've got global strategies. So multinational corporations are supposed to ensure that the fair and sustainable development can be brought about. If you put it that way, it becomes quite obvious that this is the wrong thing to hope for. Because, of course, the manager of large multinational corporations are the slaves of the financial markets. They are the slaves of short-term incentives issued by the stock exchange, by the shareholders, but also other players out there on the market who provide incentives and make it impossible for managers to take on global responsibility in the interest of the common good. Even though they might be in a position to do so, they cannot do so. In this context, you also need to take into account that many multinational corporations are really enslaved, even if they embark on a path towards corporate social responsibility, and which is what they claim. They enter into harsh competition with many other companies which are much more ruthless and are corrupt or destroy the environment or have children work for them. Therefore, competition is rather unfair. And the situation is simply incompatible compared to those companies which are committed to corporate social responsibility. How can we set in place the appropriate framework conditions within which good companies who take on their social responsibility can behave appropriately? I have learned in the field of counter-corruption that organized civil society organizations play an ever more important role. The CSOs have gained much more significance over the recent years. They have gained more and more power, which is almost threatening to a certain extent. Just remember how in Cancun or Genoa or in Seattle, civil society took to the street in order to distort and influence the negotiations. Now, this strong force, how can it be tamed? How can it be brought under control? Because now civil society organizations have assumed ever greater significance. In Germany, there is more than 1 million civil society organizations. At the University of Boston, we carried out the Johns Hopkins study in 35 countries, realizing that Civil society organizations account for $1.3 trillion in expenses. So civil society organizations assume ever greater significance. More than 39.5 million people work for civil society organizations in 35 countries. How can they play a role where they do not try to replace or represent or act as the opponent of the national government, but how can they support them and assist them, not only in the economy, but also in the private sector? In counter-corruption, I have gathered some rather interesting experience. As Shaukat Assis already mentioned, up until 1999, we were rather in a shameful situation because in most OECD countries, corruption on the part of foreign institutions was not only allowed, but even promoted. I mean, corruption was tax deductible, as my colleague said, due to public insurances or guarantees, Hermes guarantees that were granted on the part of the state institutions. They contributed to ever more serious cases of corruption. When I acted as the director for Eastern Africa, I was not familiar with these developments. All I could do was observe that renowned companies from Germany, big companies, systematically trying to influence the decision makers in Africa, in Kenya and the surrounding countries, and to bribe them. They tried to make them move away from good governments and a careful selection of projects for states to invest into. I observed projects which were implemented as the host of a donor conference which met on a regular basis in Nairobi, where all the donors knew that these projects would turn out to be detrimental to the state, to the environment, to the people living in the region. And it would incur a high debt level in those states. We were all aware of that. But nonetheless, these projects were implemented straight away. Sometimes, since we refused to give our approval as donor organizations, with our careful preparation, we refused to take on responsibility for these projects. But nonetheless, where they were implemented by big consortia, the banks, insurance companies, and other financial institutions, which very quickly invested hundreds and hundreds of millions in order to finance projects which were rather terrible, which sort of turned out to be a stumbling block for the future developments of these African countries. My list of examples is endless, and when I refused to accept this procedure in the World Bank, I was told that this is political interference into the political and social affairs of our partner countries, and that this would not be permissible. So I was kind of banned from developing a system in order to protect the people in the African countries against their own corrupt politicians who entered into an unholy alliance with their partners from Germany, Japan, or Canada, or other countries, and took the worst decisions ever. I must say that as soon as in 1977, the anti-corruption practice was adopted in the United States. So anti-corruption was very high up on the agenda, but when the Americans realized that their partners from Europe didn't follow suit, they wanted to find ways of means of reaching similar results that were attained in Germany or elsewhere. So therefore, systematic corruption was on the rise. Now, we've published our index for several years, and the Americans are not much better off. In 1977, Jimmy Carter, after the Watergate affair, took a very courageous step trying to counter corruption of American companies and American citizens abroad. This lasted up until 1999. Only in 1999 did we follow this example in Germany, or in Europe. In 1999, the OECD signed the Convention on Foreign Corruption being banned in all the signatory states of the OECD. That is all the OECD member states, by the way, and it thus entered into force. Interestingly enough, this would never have been possible hadn't we created this small civil society organization called Transparency International. Had we not spoken to the leaders of the large German multinational corporations which we met on a regular basis, first of all at the Aspen Institute at the Wannsee, had we not been able to convince the German industrialists of fighting corruption in an open letter that we sent out to Helmut Kohl back then, we wanted to encourage Germany to sign the OECD convention, and that was a major big step forward. We managed to convince the industrialists that a corruption-free economy would be of their very own interest because it would not deteriorate competition any longer. They'd be able to rely on prices and conditions in general, because in the race of corruption, they would end up being the last. But only at our third meeting did we manage to reach success, after we sent this open letter to Chancellor Kohl. Richard von Weizsäcker, by the way, chaired the first meeting shortly after he was the German president. The first meeting was characterized by a rather harsh and impolite atmosphere because the German company representatives were saying what we are doing abroad is not corruption in any way. We've got our intermediaries, our partners in the region, and depending on the contracts that we award for them, we pay out tremendous sums. But no matter how they do it, that's none of our business. It's not our cup of tea, so we don't want to get involved. Only at our second meeting 1 year later did our partners from the business community say, well, what you are doing or what we are doing abroad is something we would never be allowed to do in Germany or France or Britain. But we don't know how to get out of this trap that we moved into. And back then, we offered them to create islands of integrity. That's what we called them. We said we don't want to stop corruption in each and every part of the world overnight, because you got used to that and you've got to keep your contacts, you've got to pay bribes in order to win some politician's home. You've got all your secret accounts in Liechtenstein or Switzerland or in Germany. This is not what we are asking you to do, but we will help you to identify those markets and the competitors with which you cooperate who are also afraid of you bribing them. During a large process for public tendering of the World Bank, 5 or 10 construction companies will place a bid, but none of them will be allowed to bribe, and we will make sure that this is going to happen. It was rather interesting to see that at the third meeting, the Siemens representative took us up on the offer. He said, well, even if you try to square the circle, no matter what, we will try to get bribes under control without contracts being lost. People were highly enthusiastic about our approach, and we cooperated very smoothly. Unfortunately, they were still keeping some things in the hiding, but nonetheless, that is why we sent this open letter to Chancellor Kohl, and this is why Germany signed the OECD Convention Against Foreign Corruption, which is still, by the way, not fully in force. And here, Schaakatas is absolutely correct in saying that in some states of the world, the OECD Convention is not yet fully ratified. That holds true for Britain, for example. Here there are scandals where Britain interfered for the Serious Fraud Office, where British aerospace was persecuted. I think in France only 3 or 4 major procedures have been initiated. But in Germany, we have to say the judiciary has started to investigate these big corruption and bribery cases at an international level. Siemens, Ferrostahl, and many others have now been taken to the court, and these are cases that we are very proud of. These companies are sued because of cases of corruption abroad. But this is something that many Germans have not yet managed to understand. Of course, there are many practitioners out here in the room who might be saying, well, this is a grand vision of the future. Without corruption, we will not be able to get a contract. Some people, like Martin Walser, a famous German author, publicly said, well, the Siemens managers should get a special award and a special reward because they managed to get these big contracts in this rather difficult market abroad for Germany instead of penalizing them. You know, this violation of laws, this fatal damage which is being caused, that Dr. Flick also alluded to several times in the course of her presentation, which is caused by corruption the world over. This damage has been done, but has not yet been brought under control because it's a collective breakage of the law. But, you know, in the receiving countries, corruption has always been illegal. Only in the home countries of the donors, it was not banned. That was the real dilemma. When you talk about breaking the law as a collective, then it is exactly the phenomenon which is rather detrimental and makes us feel ashamed. You know, we defended corruption abroad for many decades, systematically and openly. I remember the time when a minister once said, well, if I prohibit corruption abroad for the German companies, then I would really make jobs redundant. You know, if a serious and socially committed company loses a contract, this is rather bad. Serious political ethics professor said, well, corruption is only illegal in Europe. It's a Christian speciality. In many other countries, it's not only tolerated, but people applaud it. Pater Europe III wrote a lot of books about economic ethics, and in an interview back then, in a Sunday paper, he said that he could actually witness these cases. He spent 2 weeks in Tunisia, and there corruption was not only being tolerated, but many had a positive attitude towards corruption because people assumed that it would give a boost to the economy. Now, this was a positive attitude which made people say to us, well, this is something that you can never change. But now, in almost all the OECD countries, foreign corruption is banned, prohibited, and will be penalized. Even Russia followed suit with the accession of the Russian Trade Organization. So did the Chinese, who, by the way, said that they never permitted their foreign investors to be corrupt. But, you know, if you try to ban the systematic corruption, you can make further headway. Now, our small organization got a lot of support within a very short space of time. We managed to win the World Bank over and counter support, so it turned from soulless to powerless. Jim Wolfensohn back then was the president of the World Bank. Now it's become one of the largest worldwide institutions in the field of counter-corruption. The United Nations and many of its subsidiaries and special organizations, counter-corruption, the UN has put it very high up on its agenda. And by the way, the fact that Shaukat Aziz alluded to is particularly significant to us. Since 2002, an Anti-Corruption Convention has been adopted by the United Nations, and it was signed by 160 states, including Germany. 150 states have already ratified this convention. But a lot of damage was done, because Germany so far has not ratified the convention. Why not? Well, as a consequence of this convention, it would be necessary to change the German penal code, stipulating that it is impossible for members of parliament to be bribed. Now, one of the particularities in Germany is that members of parliament will go unpenalized even if they're being bribed. They can sell their votes, and most people don't know about it. A city councillor in Wuppertal, for example, was sentenced because he accepted great presents from construction companies, but he wasn't taken into revision simply because he's a member of parliament. And according to German legislation, Members of parliament can be bribed and they will not be punished for it. This is a peculiarity in Germany that also exists in Austria. But of course, this legal provision needs to be amended if we ratify the convention, and that is why two parliamentary groups in the German Bundestag have voted against the ratification of this convention. And this is really a shame, because justifiably so, in Heiligendamm at G7 or G20 meetings, we always ask other countries to abide by anti-corruption laws. And we are not in a position, neither is Japan, to ratify the UN Convention, which could give us lots of additional possibilities of countering corruption at an international level. But we are not able to ratify the convention. Now, the World Bank estimates that approximately $1,000 billion on an annual basis are being lost due to corruption. $1,000 billion, that is 1 trillion. This is a significant amount. But to my mind, it is only the tip of the iceberg, because in many states of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, the real damage which has been done is much more profound due to the fact that as a consequence of corruption, erroneous economic policies are being pursued. You know, people don't build schools or hospitals or provide extension services in rural areas, which are absolutely indispensable in order to raise the standard of living and promote developments in these countries. I could give you many more examples. Here in Berlin, there is the International Secretariat of Transparency International with 130 employees from all parts of the world. We've got more than 100 national offices, some of which have more than 1,000 employees and staff members. In Bangladesh, for example, we've got 1,200 members in our chapter, as we call it, in the region. These national chapters are responsible for the diagnosis of corruption in one's own society due to one's own culture and tradition. They are also responsible for using the toolkit that we've developed in Berlin at head office. And they can choose the tools that they want to like in order to counter corruption in their countries as best they can. For example, in the field of procurement, Shaukat Assis alluded to this, be it with regards to party funding, be it in the field of trying to settle conflicts, be it in the field of protecting whistleblowers. We assume that counter-corruption needs to be based on a holistic approach. It's not about punishing and penalizing individuals only. We even believe that punishment is not really the right tool to bring about major achievements, because justifiably so, if in doubt, you should always be in favor of the person and protect those who are accused. So therefore, we are much more interested in using other tools. For example, the ban to participate in public tendering procedures, lump sum compensational payments for entire regions in cases of corruption, or the limitation of possibilities to participate in bids for public tendering, which are very important for companies. We now managed to convince the World Bank to produce something like a black list where thousands and thousands of companies are now listed which have acted in a very corrupt fashion. Now, the World Bank is on our side. What's still missing is our reach to rural areas, where we can go beyond big cases of corruption and counter petty corruption, which is particularly significant in small countries. Now, if the mother can't take the kid to a hospital because she's not able to pay $10 to bribe the nurse, or if the teacher doesn't give the kids good grades at school because the parents are unwilling or incapable of bribing them, petty corruption is a major problem in many states. But since we embark on a decentralized approach, we can get access to the locals on site. And this can trigger a demand for good governance in the region. And that is a process that we're trying to promote the world over as much as we can. I also enjoy the anti-Wolfsburg principles as a highly effective and efficient tool. This was a very well-renowned banker from New York who developed this tool together with us and representatives of the Deutsche Bank and 10 other global financial players. One example that goes to show that cooperation is of the essence. You need to cooperate with other players from the private sector, but also from state institutions and international organizations. This is how you can be successful. A good example for this magic triangle, as I normally call it, is the cooperation between civil society organizations, the state, and the private sector, is a most recent initiative that I welcome very much. I left Transparency International 5 years, and I'm a co-founder of this initiative, which is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Here we try to counter corruption in the field of raw materials and commodities. This is an area which is particularly susceptible because investments amount millions in small African countries. In rather fragile states, these investments are being made. State structures are also very weak, though the temptation is particularly great. Now, this is why it is very often called a raw materials curse, together with large 50 extractive industries, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, but also Vale, Anglo-Americans, 50 states, and with many other hundreds of organizations of civil society, has Transparency International jointly worked out a system revealing the payments that the extractive industries normally make in the favor of the host regions where they extract raw materials. It's quite surprising, but in Nigeria, not even the parliament knew about the tax revenues and dividends they generated from fees on raw materials. But on an annual basis, this exceeded $50 billion. Every year, it was $50 billion that the elite generated. And the population, 150 million people, or at least half of them, at least 50%, lived in absolute poverty. And this money was used, or rather abused, in order to purchase arms, or got lost in mismanagement. We sort of revealed the secret with the help of this EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and it encouraged 50 states to disclose the payments that they receive from the extractive industries. Now, this will, in the near future, also include forestry and fisheries. We've produced 90 reports for that matter, covering the situation in many states where the media, the government, and civil society simply did not have a clue about the amounts that the executives or state institutions generated and received from the extractive industries dealing with raw materials. Now, the cooperation between civil society organizations, the state, and the private sector can help bring about solutions that one single player would never be able to bring about. Now, my question is, can this kind of cooperation also be used to bring about success in other areas, such as countering environmental pollution, violations of human rights, climate change? I think that this is possible, but civil society organizations need to be ready for it. They need to take on this responsibility. Many CSOs don't have good governance structures which are in place either. Some pursue the wrong objective. Many bad NGOs actually move into the totally wrong direction. I mean, there are some Ku Klux Klan NGOs around pursuing the entirely wrong objective. NGOs and CSOs have to mature to a certain extent in order to be prepared for it, to be ready for the job and fit for the job. They've got to be much more open-minded concerning their own mandates and objectives. The second point is that CSOs and NGOs need to be much more open, disclosing their balance sheets. In Berlin, we have a civil society center, which is a company with limited liabilities, where the stakeholders, apart from Transparency International, which, by the way, has a total budget of 30 million euros every year, but all the other NGOs have an annual budget of more than 1 billion. These are big elephants in the room. And they've got to be subjected to the same standards. They've got to be equally open-minded and transparency, and they've got to be based on good governance that we also expect from private companies. So we need the leading staff in these NGOs to have the right skills and competences. Many people claim that Shell made a mistake when, due to Brandspar, or Greenpeace, by the way, Greenpeace made a mistake when it boycotted Shell with this tremendous effect. Then the reputation and the image of NGOs and CSOs as an equal and important player in this magic triangle can go down the drain. Now, my challenge is take action at universities, speak to the pupils in schools, try to put a much stronger emphasis on the training of leading personnel for organizations of civil society in order to make them be equipped with the competence that is required, not only in state institutions or the private sector, but also in this third area, in that third pillar. I'm deeply convinced that if we continue to move along these lines, this will at least be a solution for a transitional period, and which will help us find a way out of this ongoing, lingering governmental crisis. It is at least partly based on the laws being broken by the collective, because the laws which are currently in place, the regulations which are currently in place, are highly fragmented, compartmentalized. They give each and everyone the possibility to move back and forth between different legal systems. It can be compared to a playing field where you have a different referee with different rules and regulations, and every part on every side of the playing field. And that is the situation we are currently in as a consequence of our globalized economy. Legal systems have become rather more confusing, and the same holds true for national governments. But if we accept this as being our challenge, we need to mobilize civil society at each and every level, at the global level, national and local level, in order to get involved in identifying the problems, in order to get involved in participating and working out reforms, in order to get involved in the reforms being implemented and monitored. Then I think we will have found a solution for creating a better world without these terrible results that we are currently faced with on an ongoing basis. A world where the future, also for the children and our children's children, will be brighter and more sustainable. Thank you.